Over to you, Alasdair.
Thank you very much, Dean. And yeah, I think it's worth just saying at the start, as Dean said, there's definitely a lot of similarities, an awful lot of, how you coach an athlete with a particular impairment isn't necessarily too different in the first instance as to how you would approach coaching an athlete or any athlete who comes down. And in that, I mean, you speak to them, you take time with them, you understand them as a person, and you fit your coaching around what works for them. So in terms of leg impairments, I've put a few things down there in a similar way to Dean did, but just to talk through, I'm going to talk amputees first, and then impairments after that, and then I'll go into upper body as well. And there's differences across the board depending on the nature of an impairment, and again the nature of the athlete. So absolutely key aspect with an amputee is something around stump health. It's one of the aspects that is most challenging, and one of the aspects, actually, particularly if you have a newer athlete coming in, is generally as a newer athlete comes in, their body shape changes, and as soon as the body shape changes, then that affects their basically how well they fit into their socket, and how well you fit into the socket has a really big bearing then on how well your body handles it. And if you've got a socket that's too big, you end up getting sort of bumps and bruises and sores, and some of these sores can break down and can cause quite a long term out. One of the things that any amputee has to spend a lot of time doing is really learning what is a tiny niggle and what's a little bit sore, and what's something that needs to be taken more care of. There's only one way you're going to do that, and if you're a coach working with an amputee, and that's to work as a pair and understand it, and encourage the athlete to understand as much as they can. If they do start having a leg that is effectively shrinking and a socket that's staying the same, and they're not in the position to just get a new socket, because sockets are not cheap and they don't get made overnight, you do end up seeing athletes using sort of extra sort of socks and so on to try and make them fit. But it's definitely one of the biggest challenges, particularly for a newer athlete. Generally, once someone's being around for a longer time, they tend to sort of settle down, and is really kind of key. And moving forward, another part in terms of that socket is just sweat. The athlete has a lower sort of size of of body mass, a lower surface area rather, and therefore they've got less area to get rid of the sweat, and a large part of that area is generally covered in a great big piece of neoprene and then a big piece of carbon or plastic over the top of it. So a lot of amputees do tend to sweat an awful lot, that can therefore have an impact on the skin health, and again it can have an impact in just people having to sort of take the leg off in the middle of doing something, pour out the sweat and carry on, even in relatively cooler conditions. So these are just some of the things to be aware of as a first up, and then just the sheer cost. If you're paying for them yourself, they are not cheap, and there's something that people have to think about, particularly if there's elements of them that need repeating. In terms of what you have to watch for, it's a lot of the same stuff Dean said. So in terms of that overload piece, what you certainly don't want to do is go and throw them into a high volume endurance program first up. You want to teach them to run, you want them to run as technically well as they can, and you want through that to just basically get them moving well and efficiently before putting on the volume, really. There is often, when you have someone, when they have a blade for the first time, one of the things they want to do is almost sort of jump off the blade and use it as a spring. From two perspectives, that's not a great move. Firstly, it's not actually the most effective and efficient way to run. It's actually far better to run with a more standard gait and adapt through that. And secondly, if you are effectively jumping onto each time, again, you're putting a lot of force through that stump, and causing potential for more sort of sores and pain and stuff. So again, there will be challenges as well in terms of day-to-day life, particularly if you end up with a sore and you're therefore adapting to using crutches instead of being on two legs. While that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's not what the athlete's used to, and sometimes then reducing their mobility is something that can be a challenge and a struggle. So getting people out of their sockets can be a challenge when they have an injury and are not used to it. Again, surface types, while you would love people to run on softer surfaces all the time, blades are not always great, particularly on muddy surfaces. You can, of course, run on grass, you can run on dirt trails, but it's just pretty much as Dean said, in terms of finding a cross-country course, it's finding something that suits you well, and you can adapt so that you have got a softer surface to go on. In addition to the volume challenge and not being able to do that in the same way, there's also the intensity one. Trying to go too fast and too hard again has the same element. So it's really taking your time and not being kind of going too far ahead with it. In terms of the technical model, I think one of the key bits is effectively is that experimenting. You know, everyone would tend to have a model in their head of what good running would look like. When you're working with someone, and particularly if you've not done so before, but you're working with someone who is using a prosthetic leg, it's working out what's effective for them, and just taking your time and being patient and encouraging them to be patient and use their leg as well. The one difference, particularly if you're a single leg below knee amp, or if you're an above knee amp, a single above knee amp, or again, if you are a sort of a double below knee, quite often that sort of more standard running gait is quite common. However, I did put up there's an image of Richard Whitehead, who as a double above knee, when he runs, he runs in a completely different manner and a completely different technical model. So that's something to start investigating. And if that was to be the case, that you were working with someone like that, using someone like him as a role model may be quite effective. Opportunities is really to encourage athletes to sort of have their understanding of self, and really encourage. It's something that is always positive in any coach-athlete relationship, but one that's even more important here. And that opportunity to try different things, get volume in different ways, using cross-training and so on, and can be really, really effective. In terms of the games, to refer to, or in terms of the sort of elite side, to refer to the kind of Richard Whitehead, who I think his Twitter handle is Marathon Champ, yet the longest race he does is 200 meters. In terms of international stuff, that is generally the longest race for most amputees. So again, there are a myriad of other endurance events out there, and I'd kind of be not doing service within triathlon is an option. It's where I work, which is why I say it. But triathlon is an option for leg amputees where they can do endurance events and move on. So the other one I was going to mention was leg impairments. The athlete on the right there, he is a triathlete and someone I've had familiarity working with. Within, he has a below knee, or not a below knee, he basically has a lower leg impairment on his right side as a result of an accident when he was younger. But again, you might come against someone who has a congenital club foot or a similar condition. And one of the things that's really key is if they have an ankle and it has some function, is getting that working and getting it absorbing. Again, using softer surfaces, not necessarily overly soft, but trying to use softer surfaces. With this athlete, George, when he started really doing running, we were extremely fortunate to have an Alter G. That's not realistic out in clubland. There is now, again, not mega cheap, but a bit different, a lever running device, which allows you to be on a treadmill and reduce your impact. But again, using cross-training, using aqua jogging, lots of different ways for someone to get in their volume, and then being able to sort of do the quality, again, as Dean sort of intimated with his case study, of being able to then get in the quality at key times in running and using other aspects to get them in. Again, it's just getting used to what's effective for that athlete and how that athlete can work most effectively, and just sort of talking through. You will often, in a case like this, there isn't necessarily someone else you can refer to who's got exactly the same. So it's taking a patient approach and moving through. So obviously arm impairments, it is a little bit different. Their legs, by and large, would have the same function. There's really going to be quite often quite a difference in this case as to whether you are talking about a congenital impairment potentially, or whether it's an acquired impairment. Often with a congenital impairment, so the athlete on the top there, with an absence of her radii and ulnus, she would have like that, not her particularly, but often athletes might end up with scoliosis and imbalance just through sort of growing up and so on. So actually some of the challenge is not necessarily their impairment, but the result of their impairment. And that's something to just be aware of. Although you may see that, okay, their legs function fine, there isn't an impairment in the legs, the impairment can come from other areas. So it's working on symmetry, working on balance, working on core, and trying to overcome it. Obviously, some strengthening exercises may not be as effective when you haven't got both arms, but actually, in terms of opportunities, there can be a really fantastic opportunity, you know, to try different things and be a bit inventive in how you do stuff. And I think that's one of the most sort of engaging things. Sometimes it's actually trying different ways and finding different ways of balance. When it's an amputation or image there of Derek Ray, who has an arm impairment, again, actually still has the arm, probably causes more imbalance than it does for somebody who's got an absence of a limb or an absence of part of a limb. Again, these athletes with arm impairments are generally able to get in a higher volume again, but it's just generally looking at what they are and as an athlete and working with them as an athlete first and foremost. I have to say, and if anyone has a question on this, they can ask at the end in terms of which sort of elite level events are available in terms of athletics for these athletes. Derek obviously has been a marathon runner. Danny Crates, who's down there, was more of an 800-meter guy, and Lauren, who's the female there, is a triathlete, so sort of competes in a different way to that.